Welcome back, everyone, to Conspirinormal. It's Adam. I'm here by myself. Sarfiel is not here because he is still in the transition right now of moving to Seattle, and he will be back with us in the middle of April. Tonight, I have an interesting show, and I guess I didn't really plan it this way, but here we are going into, I think I'm going to probably put this out at the beginning of Holy Week. So we're going to talk to our guest here, Mr. John Brooks, who reached out to me and has a podcast called Hard to Believe Podcast, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And we'll also go, but we're going to talk about Jesus Mythicism tonight. And this is the idea that Jesus, as even an historical person, did not exist. So there's, I suppose, three ways of looking at Jesus. Whether there's the Christian way, there's the way that, Jesus was a teacher, he was but fully human, not divine, and then there's a way of looking at Jesus as being a total myth. So this is kind of the new way. Well, it's not really new. I was reading about it, and it seems like it's been around for couple hundred years at this point, so maybe even longer than that. But before we kind of get into that, John, let's talk about you, and let's talk about your podcast.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And
absolutely, yeah. Thanks for coming on.
What?
Thanks
yeah, my pleasure.
We'll probably make some people mad. I'm just going to warn you.
Yeah, I mean, this is a space where people get mad, and I understand it. And yeah. I'm going to tell you in advance that I'm very gentle and nice. So and I'm not a crank. So I'll put that on the table okay. Right now. But yeah, it's great to be with you. So it's pretty weird timing, to be honest, because my podcast Hard to Believe is coming to an end.
Oh, really?
At the end of this month. I have been doing it. That will be 3 years that I've been doing it. But I am carrying the feed into a new podcast. I am being joined by a co-host, so I don't have to do everything myself anymore. And I'm really excited about it. So we are launching a new podcast called Pod Only Knows. And that will be with my friend and fellow religious studies person, Kelly Baker. But in the meantime, you can go back and listen to a whole bunch of episodes of me talking about all the different ways that people believe things, both religiously and otherwise. So I cover things like historical myths and conspiracy theories, as you do. A lot of the same kind of content. I also try and kind of, look at the way that some of our pop culture properties approach the nature of belief and religion and that sort of thing. And sometimes I just have a fun, dumb episode about Gladiator 2.
Is there going to be a Gladiator 2?
There is, but unfortunately not the one that Nick Cave wrote about 20 years ago. Where Maximus dies, goes to Elysium, and then is told by the gods to go back to Earth to kill someone who claims to be the Messiah, which sounds like a wild movie that will never be. So that's coming to an end. But if you want to listen to it, and if you subscribe to it, you will automatically be subscribed to the new show, which is starting in the beginning of May.
Okay.
I also have another podcast called 1999 the Podcast, which is my fun podcast about the year 1999. Not surprisingly. And in my day job, I've been teaching religious studies for 20 some years. I have my bachelor's degree is in religious studies, and I have I like to say a master's degree in conspiracy theories. That's not really true. My master's is in digital humanities, but I spent a lot of time looking at the way that conspiracism has functioned within sort of the digital space, especially over the last 5-10 years or so, and very especially in the wake of QAnon. So that's kind of my background.
That's a whole different episode. We will probably have to, but there is one thing. But yeah, there is one thing that I do want to ask you about, and something that I think that intrigued me in your initial email that you sent me was that you said you working on the master's thesis on way conspiracies that shaped Western history, and you say that it traced it all the way to the beginning of modern conspiracism, to the event of Christianity. And I thought that that was a pretty interesting statement.
Yeah,
What do you mean by that?
kind of a lot of things. So one of the things when you're studying conspiracy theories, one of the things you should never do is try and find a genesis point for anything, because you will go like, there's people who are spend their whole lives trying to figure out who Q is, right? And it's useless, and it sort of misses the point. But one of the things that you kind of have to do when you're taking an academic approach to studying these things is like, you've got to pick a point, if not the genesis point, then a point where things kind of took shape, right, in the modern context.
Mhm.
My perspective on this is that the way that the Western conspiracy model, as we've kind of come to understand it, and all of the kind of tropes that we associate with Western conspiracism, namely the anti-Semitic tropes and tropes around, like, child sacrifice and bloodletting and all this sort of thing, that I think we can mostly trace the genesis point of at least that structure to the Imperial Roman period, and specifically the Imperial Roman period of about 2,000 years ago, when you have a emerging, and I know you've talked about this in other capacities. I think your last episode actually dealt with this, with the rise of the cults, mystery cults, right? That we call them mystery cults now.
Yeah.
And what you have is kind of in Rome, you kind of have an emerging marketplace of kind of sub religions that are individualized religions that work in conjunction with the state religion. And with that, you have kind of this democratization of ideas, right? Where you start to see kind of the balkanizing of a kind of subgroups and countercultures throughout the Roman Empire, and they're assimilating all of these different sort of multicultural ideas. You have this incredible kind of ethnic and cultural diversity at the time, and you have these religions that are taking ideas from Persia and Egypt and sort of making new things out of them. And it seems to me that what starts happening here is that you move away from sort of monolithic cultural cohesion, right, into these subgroups who are in some ways competing for membership. They're it's a marketplace, and they also are very secretive, because they are basically secret societies. They're not unlike the Masons and the Rosicrucians, right, which came later on. And as secret societies, they draw suspicion, right, from the people around them. You can't know our secret knowledge. You can't know what we know, right? You can't know the codes and the passwords and all that sort of thing. And
Sure.
that kind of naturally creates a sense of suspicion around these different groups. And one of the things that we see in early Christianity is Christianity grows as, it's not exactly the same as other mystery cults. That's one of the reasons why it's unique. But it basically exists within this marketplace. And one of the things that we start to see is Christians being accused of the same sorts of things that later the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories will be accused of. Vampirism, cannibalism, right? All of these kinds of things, because the rumor is that they eat the flesh of their god and they drink blood, and right, which is true. Like that's by their own sort of definition, like that's what they're doing.
Right.
So a lot of like the breaking up of society into these, and I think that's a good thing, by the way. I think more democratization is a good thing, but it's when you take away the sort of monolithic groupthink and this sort of one state religion thing and start creating something as personal and deep as religion, and allowing people to sort of express it in these personal ways and build these sort of competing groups, you are bound to get into a situation where you have whisper campaigns and rumors about the other groups and what they're doing and who they're in cahoots with and what their secret agenda is. And all of that really is the DNA of conspiracism. And to me, when I look at, and this is something we'll talk about when we talk about the mythicist argument, but when I look at Paul, I see in Paul these remarkable parallels between Paul and QAnon. And what you have with Paul is a guy who claims to have secret knowledge from an invisible source who has told him the real true story about what's happening in the universe. And he knows what the real plan is, right? The apocalypse is the real plan, and only if you only through him, and only if you like follow this leader, right, will you get the secret knowledge of the end times. There's a ton there that is almost as though QAnon sort of takes that blueprint and just reproduces it in the modern digital age. And it's sort of like, why did this not happen before? And I think the reason is because in most cultures prior to this, you really do have an all-powerful monolithic entity controlling everything, and nobody questions that. Like in ancient Babylon, you have just like a king, and the king's in charge, and like, so there's no reason to develop this sort of conspiratorial thinking, because life sucks, and that some big giant cabal's in charge of everything, and there's why doubt it, right? It's only when you start creating these kind of subgroups that you start having those doubts entering in, and so I think you can draw a pretty straight line in the way that conspiracism evolved and emerged in different pockets of Western history. From the emergence and then ultimately the domination of Christianity, all the way through to the protocols of the Elders of Zion and QAnon.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And QAnon does have a very kind of Christian bent to it.
Sure.
A very a very apocalyptic bent to it. It feeds into some evangelistic Christian narratives. It takes a lot from that, and the idea that, as Aaron Gulius calls it, a triumphalist conspiracy theory. In other words, it promises a better world. It's not a negative conspiracy theory, because it promises, once we get rid of the adrenochrome people,
right,
that people in Hollywood and the cabal, once we get rid of those people, there will be a new world. And basically it's kind of like the New Jerusalem, right? That's in the book of Revelations in a sense.
I'm glad you said that. I think you're dead on. One thing that people need to understand, I think, about these sort of massive institutional conspiracy theories, is that they all ultimately, yes, are anti-Semitic. Right? That tends to be true. But there's always an optimism in them. And that optimism often involves massive destruction and violence and a complete breakdown of the existing systems, but ultimately a replacement with a new one. Right. The QAnon mantra was trust the plan. And the idea was basically like all of the evils of the world are going to be exposed. Now, you can have good faith disagreements about what the QAnon people think are the evils of the world. But it's this idea that like the reason that everything sucks for you is because literally the man has been working against you, and there is a plan to unveil it and to change it and to destroy it and to bring about something new and better. And that is very literally what apocalypticism was in 2,000 years ago, right? The sort of apocalypticism that Paul preached was, it was this idea that like the reason things suck for the Jews was because God's about to reveal the plan, the master plan, right? Trust the plan. Like that's that's exactly what Paul's saying.
It's an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah. And I don't know if I'm necessarily like all conspiracy theories are anti-Semitic in nature, but I would say though that a lot of them base themselves on an anti-Semitic trope. And from that root you get, so you just it's basically a Mad Lib. You just fill in what entity, it's the Jesuits, or the Illuminati, or sometimes that's the same thing. That's usually are the mythical they, but it pulls from this whole idea that that was started because of anti-Semitism in a lot of ways.
Right, and a lot of those tropes that Jews got accused of, starting with the blood libel in the Middle Ages, those tropes are borrowed from the same tropes that Christians were accused of before Christians were dominant.
That's true.
Right, it's this like marginalized separate class who keeps to themselves that you have to be suspicious of, and are
Yeah.
easy targets for you to build conspiracy theories around. When I say the anti-Semitic thing, in my experience in most modern conspiracies, it's kind of like the Scooby-Doo thing where you just like keep pulling off the masks. And like
Yeah.
once you get to the last mask, it's anti-Semitism. Right?
Eventually you get to that point. And
Right.
and I mean, at the same time that the Jews were being, I mean, the Christians were being persecuted and said that about them, Jews were also being said the same thing.
Oh, sure.
I mean, there's anti-Semitic blood libel that goes back even before pre-Christian. I mean, some of that goes back into at least the 2nd century BC, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
We did a whole show about this, about the blood libel and kind of where it comes from. And I was shocked to find out that it actually went that far in time, to be honest with you. But
I mean, the modern version of it is very clearly sort of high Middle Ages, but yes, the basic, the blueprint, the DNA of it goes back a very, very long way. And it rests in some very primal fears, right? I mean, we have this human primal fear of blood that we've sort of evolved, which makes sense.
Yeah.
Because when we see it, we're like, uh-oh.
It's true.
And a primal fear of children being harmed, right? I mean, that's just something that is very easy to harness to create a narrative whereby you can convince people to do harm to others, because these basic fears are so deep within our DNA. You know, and again, it's the same thing with like adrenochrome and Pizzagate. It's the same story, right? It's blood harvesting and child sacrifice or whatever it is that's going on at, you know, Comet Ping Pong in Washington, DC.
When you pull in the threat to children, you're not talking about just basic humanity. You're talking about us as mammals,
right?
I mean, you're getting to something that's extremely primeval and is very much can trigger the base brain. And that, you know, I think that's why it's so dangerous, and that's why it's so effective at the same time.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely right, for sure.
Let's get into the Jesus mythicism stuff, but I think what we'll try to do first is kind of like your own personal journey with this. And I mean, I can tell you, I mean, basically that, like, I mean, I still consider myself a Christian. I don't, I'm not as church going as I used to be, but especially since COVID and started, and just kind of the foolishness that churches were engaged. So a lot of churches were engaged in at the time. And I've just really started to become impatient with it. And, but you know, I still consider myself basically a Christian, you know, but I think a lot of what I believe is really based in faith. So I'm willing to, you know, go down to the basic of, well, Jesus was a man and the religion was built up off of him. But with Jesus mythicism, we're talking about Jesus never existed. This is a mythical character, just like King Arthur. Let's just kind of talk about your personal journey, you know, like coming to this conclusion, and then we can talk about the points, I guess, of why Jesus may or may not be real.
Okay. So this is a long and sort of multi-roaded journey.
That's fine. We have time.
So. I know. Yeah. So I think I alluded to you when we were talking over email. I might have, I don't remember what exactly I said in the email, but the where and how I came to my current position on this was recently, and B, kind of kicking and screaming. I really, really resisted the coming to this conclusion, and there's some very good reasons as to why, right? And we'll get to that. This is a very murky and very sort of a field that's very much in its infancy, I think, in terms of academic credibility anyways. So I really did not want to come to this conclusion. And I really for a very long time, very much was what we would call a sort of a minimal historicist. which is the basic premise that I think most academics now sort of just have settled on, and I have some theories as to why, but that, you know, Jesus was this guy and he had a cult following, and then he died, and then his followers were like, well, that sucks, and then sort of built this sort of posthumous religion around him. And, you know, that most of what's in the Gospels is you know, highly fictionalized and whatever, but there is some core person, right, that was at the start of all that. I grew up sort of, you know, nominally Christian, I suppose. I grew up as an Episcopalian. My family's English.
I did too. So
right. So you can kind of relate. Um, yeah, so kind of like culturally Christian, but never really. I was always very. I mean, I have my degree in religious studies, obviously, so religion's always been an area of academic interest to me. I've always found it bizarre and weird and fascinating, and certainly like always wanted to sort of believe that there was a God, but, you know, sort of I came to the conclusion that there wasn't, maybe a decade or so ago, right? And just was like, I just, this is just where I'm at. So, you know, like, I had everything in place to just sort of settle on the historicist, the sort of minimal historicist perspective. And the other thing that I think this is really important to the conversation is that most mythicists are complete fucking cranks, right? Can I swear on your show? I'm sorry.
I'm fine. Yeah, I'm fine with it. It doesn't bother me.
All right. Sorry to the children in the room.
I could put a big E on the on the feed if you really want me to.
No, but that's the best way to describe them. So you know, these are the Graham Hancocks of the religion world, right? You know, these are just people who, like, they really don't understand the data, they don't understand the field, they see connections that maybe do exist but don't exist for the reason they think they exist. And, you know, you have guys like Joseph Atwill, who, like, in 2005 released a book where he claimed that Christianity was a conspiracy that was, you know, put together by the Roman Empire to break up Jewish community. It's just, yeah,
this is Caesar's Christ thing.
Yes, that's the one. It's complete junk. It is absolute nonsense. So you have
if that's true, that radically backfired on the Roman Empire eventually.
Or kind of didn't, because Christianity also kind of saved the Roman Empire. But whatever, like, it's a long story, and it's not worth talking about because it's complete nonsense. So then you have that. You have a bunch of, like, you know, Bill Maher, who has no idea what he's talking about, and like makes a documentary about religion that is just completely full of, you know, Wikipedia information and like stuff he probably got from like GeoCities websites in like 1998.
I think, not to interrupt you, but I think just like a lot of it is that, like, people are dealing with the kind of the, like, Bill Maher, I think he just generally just has a hatred for religion. And I don't think you have a hatred for religion. So some people, I mentioned the before we got started, we talked a little bit about the God That Wasn't There documentary. And I watched that kind of in preparation for this, and it really did not bring any clarity to anything, because a lot of the first, it was maybe 15 minutes of him saying, okay, Jesus isn't real, and then the rest of it is just an axe to grind with Christianity, which, hey, I get it, there are plenty of axes to grind with Christianity. We've talked about them a lot on this show with other Christians, but it is, you know, it just was not, it was just like filling out an hour space. So I feel some people have just a personal axe to grind.
100%.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why this is such a difficult position to hold is because the unique place that religion has with people, where there's basically three camps. There's people like me who are academically minded and who pursue it from that perspective and have no, like, skin in the game in terms of, you know, the salvation of my soul or whatever. And there's a lot of us, right? Then there's people who are religious studies academics and also apologists, right? So they are, you know, deeply invested in also sort of like proving X, Y, and Z. And then there's Bill Maher, right? And or you know, really bitter evangelicals and that sort of thing, who just like understandably are traumatized by religion in some way, or just have some baggage, and that makes it really difficult. But it's always going to be a sensationalist topic, which is why someone like Joseph Atwill can sell books, because all he has to do is make up a bunch of BS, and boom, you've got yourself a book, right? And it really kind of poisons the well for having a real good faith discussion about this topic. So that was sort of my perspective. And then there's also, I mean, you also have on the other side of it sort of the hyper historicists, like the Dan Browns of the world, who like, then weave the story of Jesus having children, and it is just such a poisoned conversation in sort of the popular conversation, right? That it's really, really hard to like even kind of break ice on this,
which he ripped off from Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and
absolutely right, which is all again and all just a
right.
bunch of conspiracy nonsense to sell books. So when it comes to taking this position, my feeling, and I want to make it clear that I right now, based on all of everything that I've ever come to know and everything that I've read and everything that every argument that I've come across, I believe it is more likely that Mark, or the author of Mark, invented a earthbound Jesus who existed within a historical framework, within a historical narrative, and that invention was a way of euhemerizing, which is to say, taking a mythic figure and putting them into history, which happens a lot, right, with mythic figures. Euhemerizing a previously existing celestial being who, and I want to make this clear, Paul genuinely did think existed, right? That's the difference, that he's not made up, he's not a fantasy, and it's not a conspiracy, but Paul believed this figure existed, but did not exist on earth. That this was a heavenly figure that Paul was getting information from, and that the people who predated Paul, Cephas or Peter, however you want to talk about him, they had come to the same conclusion. They'd started a similar kind of a cult in Jerusalem, but this was where the whole Jesus movement started. It seems to me now that is more likely than not. Now, if some archaeologist comes along and presents some undeniable and very, very sort of compelling evidence of a historical Jesus that refutes that, I am all ears and I can't wait to hear it, and I would be entirely receptive to it, right? But unfortunately, every time someone seems to do that, it's like the ossuary of James, which is a complete fraud, or it's like, the Shroud of Turin, right, which is a complete fraud. And it's like, we just don't have that tangible evidence. But I'm open to changing my mind if I see evidence that changes my mind. But so far nothing has. So I can tell you like sort of how I specifically came to that conclusion
Sure.
in a bit. But
yeah,
I'll pause if you have anything, if you want to respond to any of that.
The Shroud of Turin is interesting. I don't know if that's. I don't know. I mean, it's a fraud. I mean, because of the dating on it, but it's pretty damn sophisticated.
It is. It's very sophisticated.
Whatever it is, there is that idea that it could have been a form of ancient photography or medieval photography, which is interesting. That's a book that I read a long time ago about it. But yeah, so I think my question is, and we can go back to how you kind of came to this, but this mythical being that Paul is talking about, how does he encounter this mythical being? And then and you kind of turned me on to Richard Carrier's work.
Yeah.
Like, as Carrier has made the statement, but I haven't heard him really expound on this yet. And I've only watched a couple of interviews. That in ancient Judaism, there was this character, there was this being that was part of, I guess, of their religious experience. Who was that? Who is that person, or that being, rather than that entity that they're talking about?
That's where it gets a little complicated. Let me come back to that, because that's a really great question. And it's one of those things where you need to rethink what your assumptions are about first century Judaism. And I think the Dead Sea Scrolls is a really important discovery in that it helped and still is helping, right? People are still sort of digesting what the Dead Sea Scrolls imply, but the multifaceted nature and weirdness of like Imperial Roman Judaism is pretty extraordinary.
Yeah.
You might know that the quest for the historical Jesus is one of the great academic failures of all time, right? It has been done in multiple phases, and every time it has come up empty. And
Well, don't say that to Bart Ehrman. No,
Jesus. Okay. I'm just about to talk about Bart Ehrman. I
By the
love
way,
Bart.
if you listen to the last show, Heather, who I
Yeah.
just had on,
Yeah.
she actually took a class from him
Oh,
at UNC Chapel Hill.
I'm intensely
Yeah.
jealous of that. She was great. I really enjoyed listening to her. I love Bart Ehrman. I've read almost all of his books. I still read his books. I still agree with him almost all the time. But ironically, the thing that drove me into the arms of mythicism was his book, Did Jesus Exist? In which he seems to think that he is making a convincing and conclusive claim that Jesus existed. I was so excited to read that book because I'm like, nobody knows more about, classical Christianity than Bart Ehrman does. And I can't wait to read what he has to say. And I was crushingly disappointed. I mean, like, just brutally disappointed by it. Because he rests most of his argument on one single piece of evidence that I don't think is even convincing evidence, and then everything else is just kind of conjecture and just sort of like, well, obviously this wouldn't have happened if this happened, and it's like, no, I'm not satisfied with this. And I think when I realized that the person that I most admire to talk objectively about early Christianity really dropped the ball on this, I was like, there's got to be more here. There's got to be a better explanation. And when I finally started, people like Robert Price, who I despise, but I think he's a pretty good mythicist. And people like Carrier, who I read his argument. I actually have read his peer-reviewed 25,000 page or whatever it is book, cover to cover, and I think he makes a really compelling case. And to me, like, the litmus test was, in reading that, a lot of these questions that I'd had for so long of like, why would he say this, or why did this happen, or why did this not happen this way, a lot of those pieces fell into place. And I just felt like this explains a lot of those nagging questions that I've had for so long, that until something better comes along, I think I kind of have to settle with this as my perspective, and also be open and honest about it, because I don't think it serves anybody for me to pretend that I'm still a historicist when I'm not. I don't. This works better for me, and I think it's worth, sort of putting my own limited amount of clout behind that, which is what I've kind of taken on doing.
So, what was the straw that broke the camel's back for you that disproved, without a shadow of a doubt, that there was no historical Jesus?
Again, nothing has proved it beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Gotcha.
But right, I still have shadows of doubts.
Gotcha.
Like, what I will say, if we're going to use that terminology, if existing was a crime, no court on earth would convict Jesus of it, right? Like, I think that's basically the way I look at the evidence that we have. The biggest thing for me, and I think this is something that, because of the way that the Bible is edited, the way that it's specifically structured with the Gospels first, academics know, we all know, right, that the Gospels are not first, that the earliest written documents that we have are the authentic letters of Paul, of which there are 7 of the 14 letters that are attributed to him, right?
That's true.
So academic consensus is the Pauline letters. And so I started taking a different methodology to the way that I looked at what the Bible suggests about what it's telling us Jesus is. I ignored everything after Mark. as far as the gospels go, because if you're going to use any of the canonical gospels for any kind of evidence of historicity, you can't go beyond Mark, because Mark is the earliest of those four. And you have to sort of mentally reshuffle and consciously go into Paul and Paul's authentic letters, knowing that this is the earliest documentation that we have of the canonical work. I think there's some other stuff in the Bible that's probably around the same time. I actually agree with Gary Stevens. Apocalypse of John is quite a bit earlier than is usually attributed to it. I think the letter of First Clement is earlier than most scholars attribute to it. But that's neither here nor there. The fact is, when you look at Paul, you ignore the Gospels and ignore everything else and just read what Paul is telling you, right? You notice some things that are very compelling and very curious. One of them is that the idea of a second coming of Jesus is a purely liturgical idea. That is not what Paul says. Paul never talks about the second coming of the Lord. He talks about the coming of the Lord. Paul writes as though Jesus has not yet arrived, right? Paul never says second, and that always bugged the hell out of me, right? I'm like, why is he talking about it this way? There's other things. I mean, Paul goes out of his way in Galatians to say, none of what I know about Jesus came from manly sources, came from earthly sources. Everything I know about Jesus came from revelation. Now, a lot of historicists will say, well, yeah, Paul doesn't care about the earthly Jesus because we know we never met him, they never overlapped, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm like, I really have a hard time. I mean, that's fine, but I have a hard time buying that argument, because it seems like Paul would do very, very well to at least invoke this guy who he thinks was the Messiah at some point, even if he never met him. But he insists that nothing that he knows about Jesus comes from anything but revelation. I also have a personal kind of connection to this, because I know there's a lot of, like, when I read Paul, I see a lot of myself in Paul in this way in particular, which is that there's a lot of theories that Paul was epileptic, and that Paul's encounter in Damascus, on the road to Damascus, was a seizure.
Right. I've heard that theory. Yeah.
I'm also epileptic, and I've experienced what a seizure can do to just like sort of reset your entire brain. What we know about Paul is that something happened to him at some point that reset his entire brain, and that he, in his kind of first century logic, took it to be divine revelation and an encounter with Christ. To me, it makes perfect sense that he was aware that there was this group who believed that the Messiah had been crucified in heaven and died for the sins of mankind in heaven, and was soon to come to earth to bring about the New Jerusalem. And that in his seizure, believed that he had been chosen as the messenger for that. Because here's this guy who is about to go speak to, if the historicists are right, the guys who knew Jesus, and he has no respect for them whatsoever. Doesn't care less about the fact that they apparently were like friends with Jesus or Jesus's brother or whatever else. And that just doesn't make sense to me. I can't get my head around that one, right? So, you know, it's the basic facts on the ground of what Paul says, that if we were to take Paul as basically the earliest source that we've got, and he is, and what Paul describes to me is not a guy who lived in Nazareth who had a cult following that suddenly he's now in charge of. It tells a very different story.
Okay. Well, based on that, let me ask you, who is this? So we'll go one step back, because we'll go Paul before Paul has his conversion on the road to Damascus. And by the way, to make a statement, I've always heard that in the ancient world, epileptics were considered divinely inspired or divinely touched by the gods. There was this, Alexander the Great was supposedly an epileptic. Caesar was an epileptic. We know that for sure. So, these great men, some of them were even considered like demigods. So that there is that ancient tradition there. So that's interesting. But that's more of an aside. So we go one step back to, I guess, who is it that baptizes Paul, that tends to, after he's blinded. I can't remember the name. I'm blanking on the name.
Oh
So
yeah.
so that figure and Peter, um, who
Right.
is the figure? Who is the figure that they are saying is crucified
Jesus.
in heaven,
Yes.
not on the earth?
So that figure is Jesus Christ.
Okay.
And here's basically how that works. So one of the things we know about a person who is a really important sort of missing link in this is Philo of Alexandria.
All right.
And we know a lot about what Philo of Alexandria taught. We know a little bit about where he went. And there is reason to believe that he was in Jerusalem right around the time that someone like Peter would have started a Jesus cult. So there's nothing conclusive about that. We can't place Philo, as the guy who kind of went and started this idea and this cult in Jerusalem, but it's not beyond possibility, right? And certainly like it matches kind of timeline wise. So Philo and Alexandria, as I'm sure you know, was a place of enormous religious and philosophical diversity.
Right.
Where you have this sort of like Neoplatonist movement happening, a lot of like Hellenist philosophy mixing with Judaism and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
The Septuagint, right, is like a product of the great Alexandrian experiment.
Right.
And Philo seems to be talking about this very thing, right? In Philo's writings, he seems to be talking about a celestial Messiah. And I could point you to some of them or whatever, but the there does appear to have been a sort of philosophical Platonist tradition of this. Now, one of the things about Platonic philosophy is that it argues that in the kind of heaven sphere, there is a ideal reproduction of all earthly things, right?
That's Hermetic philosophy. That's above as above, so below, essentially.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's like the resurrection hub in Battlestar Galactica, right? So like that kind of
Nice.
thing.
That's a nice reference. I approve of
Yeah.
that. It's one of my favorite shows ever. Yeah.
Oh, me too. We could have a whole different conversation about
Sure.
that. But that's that idea in Battlestar Galactica is essentially what sort of what Paul's imagining, that there is a heaven space that has a perfect reproduction of all of the flawed things on Earth. And one of those, right, is sort of the perfect reproduction of the Jesus character, the final Messiah. Paul talks a lot about, like, one of the things Paul says that a lot of historicists point to, for instance, right, is that Jesus was born of a mother. And they're like, well, aha, he was born of a mother. Well, like, he never says a virgin or Mary. He says a mother. And like, if you know anything about, celestial beings, they also have mothers. Like Hera was a mother. Like this is how people kind of thought, right?
Yep. That's true.
Stuff plays out that way. Or like that he was born of the seed of David, right? And people were like, is there intergalactic semen? And like, yeah, there is. Like, this is literally how people thought. We could get back to the seed of David thing if you want to. Like, that's a very sort of niche part of this argument, but I think it's a really interesting one. So one of the things that is always very, very suspicious about Jesus as a Messiah, what people don't realize is that the first Messiah, the first person to have or claim the title of Messiah, which means anointed, right, in Hebrew, is Joshua. When Moses is about to depart this mortal coil, he sees Joshua as a worthy successor, and so he anoints Joshua and he gives him the title Messiah. Well, the anglicized, if you go through the Greek, the anglicized name of Joshua Messiah is Jesus Christ, right? Like, literally, that's what Joshua's name is. So it stands to reason that, like, if you are part of this apocalyptic messianic tradition, you are going to believe that the final Messiah will also be Jesus Christ, right? It's basically the perfect version of the Joshua mold, right? So Joshua's name is Yeshua, which means God saves.
Right.
And that got translated into, like, there's this whole Greek to English in between, right? The name is in Greek is Eushus, and sort of that's what it's translated both as Joshua and then Jesus. But then in the English version, you get two separate names, right? Well, it's very complicated, but it's the same name. And the other time that this name appears is when you take so Yehu means God in the Yahweh form, right? And in Hebrew, El means God in the Elohim form. So to get very nerdy on you, for instance, right? The name Jonathan and the name Nathaniel are the same name, right? It's just that one is the Yahweh, Natan, and the other is the Il, Natan, right? So Natan Il and Yehu Natan, it's the same name, right? It's just the two different names of God in the Hebrew tradition. The other Jesus in the Bible is Elisha, who is the Elohim form of God saves, and his mentor is Elijah. And Mark makes the claim that John the Baptist, who, by the way, I think was a real figure, just so we're clear, that John the Baptist was the reincarnation, essentially, of Elijah, and that Jesus is the reincarnation, thus, of Elisha, right? Because it's the same name, except the roles are kind of reversed, and there's this. It's I'm not going to get too nerdy and complicated on it. But the argument the carrier makes essentially is that a bunch of messianic apocalyptic Jews got so frustrated with there not being a Messiah that they came to believe that the Messiah had already played out in heaven, and that what they were waiting for was already taking place, and that Messiah had sacrificed themselves to the demons, essentially, and become resurrected to defeat death. And soon he was going to come to earth, wipe out the Roman Empire, rebuild Jerusalem, and allow everybody to live forever in harmony. And that's why Paul's like, don't bother getting married because the world's about to end soon, right? It's why Paul is so fervently apocalyptic.
Right.
I don't think you need a guy for any of this. And one of the frustrations that I tend to have with historicists is that they create what I would call kind of a Jesus of the gaps, right? They marginalize Jesus so much that what you have left is just a husk of a person. And I'm like, well, is it worth having? Do we need this person to explain everything?
Mm-hmm.
And if the explanation can be put in place without him, I think you got to favor that explanation.
Okay, so I'm going to ask. Okay, let me ask this question first.
Yeah.
How does this? You mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls. How does this tie in to what is in the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily. It's just that the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed that Jewish religious and philosophical thought was a hell of a lot more diverse and esoteric than we had known it to be 100 years ago.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And I still think we're still kind of processing everything that's in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I still think there's a lot of academic work like to be done and being done about exactly what they mean and what they imply.
I know there's references to things like the teacher of righteousness, and there is one school of thought that maybe is Jesus.
There's also a school of thought that's John the Baptist, and yes, and so if the teacher of righteousness is Jesus, that means that the idea of Jesus has been around for a lot longer than the 1st century AD.
Right, because it's an older concept. Yeah,
correct. And predates it. On the other side of this, like going beyond Paul, the reason why I think the Gospel of Mark only reinforces this idea is because I love the Gospel of Mark. I think it is one of the most clever pieces of writing in the history of language, right? And Mark appears to be, you can assemble Mark without anything new, right? You can take the Odyssey, you can take Homer, and you can take a mishmash of Hebrew scriptures, and you can take the story of Elisha and Elijah, and you can take the story of Joshua, and you can take some stuff from Isaiah and from Daniel, and you can construct Mark, right? You don't need a person to ever have said anything in order for Mark to exist. And what most people, because most people ignore Mark because they think it's just a watered down version of Matthew. And of course, all scholarship now says like, no,
Right.
no, other way around. Right.
It's the other way around. Mm-hmm.
And Mark is a really unique and fascinating gospel because Mark has this thing that we call the messianic secret. I don't know if you know too much about that. I can talk a little bit about that if you need me to elaborate on that at all. But it's the coolest feature of Mark.
I want to clarify. I want you to clarify something.
Yeah.
So in this realm that is built directly on top of ours in this cosmology.
Okay. Yeah.
So everything is the same. So there's like counterparts of me and you in that realm. So in other words, in the 1st century AD, there are Romans there too. And
you would think so.
And they're just as terrible in that realm as they are down here.
Yeah.
So you're kind of screwed either way. So, but the Romans still in the Sanhedrin is there too. So the Romans crucify Jesus in that realm.
Yeah.
And that's what they're talking about. Is that basically is that the idea?
I don't think Paul thinks of it as Romans. Paul says it's the archons of the age.
Archons, yeah. Which is the Gnostics pick up on that later. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the existence of Gnosticism is also compelling evidence for this, but that's another kind of side note there. So yeah, I don't think it's Paul. I think Mark is the one who transfers that story into the Romans and makes the Romans the evil devils, archons of the age, because Mark is responding to the Jewish uprising, right? He's responding probably to the destruction of the temple, and he's seeing this like apocalyptic holy shit moment, and he's writing this urgent screed, right, about sort of like better get your act together, and transposing the demonic forces that murdered, that crucified the Lord in the sky, onto the Romans. That's kind of how I've come to see it.
Okay.
And so Mark structures his gospel with what's called the messianic secret, and it's the weirdest thing about the gospel, which is that Jesus is constantly telling people not to tell anybody he's the Messiah. Right? He's like, I'm the Messiah, but keep it a secret, don't tell anybody, right? And he does this thing. So the curious thing about Mark is that Jesus, when he teaches in parables, he does this thing where he's like, I don't teach in parables to make it clear to people, I teach in parables to make it obscure to people. And getting back to what I was saying at the very beginning here about this idea of like secret knowledge and conspiracism, right? I suspect that Mark was crafted as a deliberately metaphorical and secretive text, right, for a certain cult of Christians, what Gary Stevens calls, I think appropriately, Jesus clubs. I really like that term. I think it's a really good way of thinking about it, right? And it's very clear that this is secret information because Jesus keeps saying, I'm only saying this to the people who understand it. Right. And it's almost as though Mark is saying through the text, what I am writing here is a metaphor. This is not meant to be taken literally. This is a metaphor about, if Jesus existed in the world, and I've replaced Jesus with this guy from Nazareth, and I've replaced the archons with the Romans, and so on and so forth. And only you who are in my club will understand what this is all about. And everybody else is not saved. So screw them anyway. It doesn't matter. And then when we see that those things change in Matthew and Luke, as this idea of a historical Jesus begins to kind of take shape, I think sometime around the 90s AD, right? They just sort of think that part's confusing. They don't use it, and they write a much more straightforward kind of almost biographical, right, sort of narrative of Jesus with the miracles and the lessons and everything else. And Matthew is more interested in sort of like reframing Jewish teaching and ethical teaching and all that sort of thing. And I just think that over time, people just, there was a thread of Christianity who were like, oh yeah, this guy must have really existed, and this is what my tradition is and what's been passed down to me. And it just sort of, that ended up winning. That ended up being the model that caught fire, and the rest of them died off. And we know there were a bunch of others, right? We know there were other understandings of Jesus that are very different, and certainly they might believe Jesus came to earth, but they certainly don't believe he was human, right? And that was a pretty common belief.
Yeah, there's some of the Gnostics that believe that this might have been the Valentinians. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
That they believed that Christ was just this like vaporish form.
Right.
That, because, by that point, dualism is coming in, and they're,
right.
There's no way that this person, this entity could be made anything physical, because everything physical is bad. So I guess making this figure into a real person, giving him this history, allows for better proselytization on the part of these groups.
That's a great question. That's a place that I'm really interested in right now. Right. So as I've kind of decided to take on this perspective in kind of academic pursuit, right, that's a place that I'm really interested in. Why? Carrier's talked a little bit about this, and he has some theories about it, and I'm not like overly compelled by one way or the other. I would guess, just if I'm kind of putting myself in the position, that I think that it sells better. I think that's pretty much it, right? That these are very, Paul's theology and Christology is very esoteric and highfalutin, right? It's sort of hard to sell to the common audience. I suspect, and I'm to give a sort of corollary example, I don't think Siddhartha Buddha existed either, right? Like I don't think this is a real person. I think that this is a school of thought that emerged that created an origin story for itself, and it's a very compelling and complex and rich and human origin story. But I think the reason that you do something like that is not just that it helps preserve the tradition, because you can ground it in something that is much more relatable and much more sort of immediate, but also that it's sort of like, yeah, as human beings, we want the evidence of like something that happened on Earth, right, in order to sort of be more compelled by the story. And I suspect that it was the groundedness of this kind of post-Pauline, post-gospel Jesus that made it a good sell. I don't know. I'm still really curious to sort of understand how the so-called switch happened, if a switch happened. But that would be my best guess, is that it sells better, right? Like it's just, it's one of the reasons why I think people are resistant to this theory in general, is because, especially believing Christians who are not going to, and they shouldn't, like, they should believe what they want to believe. This is not, I'm not saying this to convert Christians into like, this perspective. But those who are academic, right, and who don't have a skin in the game, so to speak, the compelling thing is we want some earthly activity to have happened to confirm everything else. But I think for someone like Paul, you didn't need that. That he fundamentally really did believe this happened, and believed that Jesus Christ existed, and it's not a fantasy to him. It's not a myth. It's not superstition. It's a real thing that really happened. But human beings prefer, it's like why people want to know who Q is, right? It's the same fucking thing. It's like, right. It's like, I just need to confirm like this one person and this one thing, and then I can buy a whole bunch of other stuff.
You hit on something, and this is something that in the historicist point of view, that they talk a lot about how once Paul begins to go on his missions, which is to the Greek speaking world, and the Bible, and a lot of people actually don't know this, the books of the New Testament are all written in Greek. There's no Hebrew books of the New Testament or Aramaic.
No.
So
there's not.
After Paul does this, there is this idea that eventually Jesus takes on these traits of these other kind of rising and dying gods that were all demigods that were part of the Greco-Roman culture, like Dionysus, Hercules. There's very similar traits between
Prometheus,
these gods, and Jesus. And I mean, in some ways, it's pretty unescapable. So the historicists say that this was just something that was grafted on to make that more appealing to the Greeks. You're kind of, even what you're saying really and I think others are saying, is that you're pushing that a little earlier, even
Yeah.
before Paul has his conversion experience, that it may have been these Hellenized Jews that came up with a concept that is very similar, because you said you can, like Hera's a mother. She gives birth to gods. She gives birth to Apollo and Artemis. These gods that are produced in this other realm. Well, just as say Joshua the Savior is produced in this other realm. So it's almost like there's a cross pollination where these Hellenized Jews are probably picking this up from Hellenic religion. Is that something safe to say?
That is, I think I'm glad you made that point. It's a great point. I got two things to say about that. One, you in your episode that you just released, most recent to when we're talking, you talked about your guest talked about the evolution of Yahweh and Elohim, and how they're borrowed from other religions and sort of then recast, and this is a tradition that is as old as Judaism, right? Judaism has always been doing this, and Judaism is first and foremost a religion of intellect. It's a religion of writing and arguing with that writing and criticizing that writing and hybridizing and trying and distilling and really engaging with mythology and allegory and archetype, right? That's sort of the richness of its core. And so from that perspective, none of this surprises me, right? This is what's always been done. In fact, it's sort of the argument's often made that when Judaism made the final shift from what we call monolatry, which is the primary worship of a single god, to monotheism, is during the Babylonian exile, and probably that has to do with interactions in Persia with Zoroastrians,
right?
And sort of taking on these, being like, that's a really cool theology and idea. We're just going to use it in ours now, because they've always seemed to understand that part of religion is man-made. But like, you can make religion enough that you do get close to some kind of universal truth or God, right? That seems to be kind of a thread of Judaism all along. And so if that what you're saying is right, then yeah, it's completely in line with everything else. And the other thing on that note is, I'll also say that if Jesus was a real person, then it's really an anomaly in the history of religion, because the thing is, most scholars now also agree that Moses is a mythic figure, that Moses never existed, right? That David is at best a very, very, very minor resemblance to anything that's in the Bible, and I think even that is incredibly sketchy on the evidence. And that coming up with sort of, mythic versions of big ideas is just part of that tradition. And so if Jesus was first real, it seems like it would almost kind of violate the majority of the tradition, right? It would make Jesus kind of weird within that framework.
And that's something that I think, I mean, I want to hedge what I'm saying, because I do consider myself a Christian, but I want to say that I think that messes us up as post Enlightenment 21st century individuals, where we get our news pretty quickly and we've got this documented, everything's online, and we can go to Snopes and we can prove it never happened, or
right.
But the blur between fact and fiction for the ancient world, their concepts were completely different. There was no concept of really history in itself is in its nascent form, the writing of it. So all their concepts are completely alien to how we see the world as post-Enlightenment 21st century people.
Sure.
And I put an emphasis on that, on the Enlightenment, because that's really the beginning of rationality in thought.
Yeah, as we understand it now, for sure.
Right.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. Yeah. No, I agree with that. I like it's difficult. So I know some people, or like I know of some people who have accepted this view and remain Christian, right? Who still love the tradition and love the faith and are like, well, if Jesus, I mean, if I believe in heaven and if I believe that like God does stuff in heaven and like saints live in heaven or whatever, then like, why is this any different? Why does Jesus have to have existed on earth?
Yeah, I see. I could see how there could be an opening there. Again, I'm going to say this: it does seem that there is there really is the viewpoint now,
yeah,
in Christianity, but it's particularly in the more evangelical far right, that you are dealing basically with this God. You know, Jesus is just the wrathful, vengeful God, and
yeah,
it's and he's much more divine than he is human, which
yeah,
essentially is which essentially, if you really want to take it down to it, is really kind of heretical according to the Nicene Creed, because you know the ancient church spent a long time hashing this out, whether Jesus was fully human, fully divine, and they finally said he is both. But there is no humanity. There is very little humanity in a lot of this really right wing, rabid.
yeah.
You know, he's the storm vengeful God. I mean, you know, that's what it's become. So it's interesting that it's kind of it's interesting to be seen in that light.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about some of these proofs that the historicists use, and when we're not talking about the proofs of, so we're not talking about any Christian mainline Christian proofs. What we're talking about, we're throwing the Gospels out. Okay, we're just completely, you know, whether you believe in them or not.
Sorry, they're in the trash. No more Gospels.
Yeah, well, we sort of are. But for the sake of this argument, we're throwing them out.
Yeah.
But so one thing that came up in a debate that I watched yesterday and today. What about the Q source? We're not talking about QAnon.
Oh,
we're talking about the Q source.
Okay.
Supposedly, this thing that both Matthew and Mark,
yes,
or I guess Matthew and Luke drew from, that is basically a sayings gospel, which is, and the Episcopal Church actually was really big on this. I remember getting a book about this in the Episcopal Church. They were actually selling it in the bookstore.
Sure. Okay. So this is a place where Carrier and I, for instance, like I part ways with him. He is a virulent anti-Qist.
Yeah.
Mark Goodacre, who I also like quite a bit, who is a historicist, is also an anti-Qist. I have a hard time. There's reasons why I can't quite get myself to the place that Matthew used Luke as a source or vice versa. There's problems with that theory, right? Like there's problems with every theory, but there's problems with that theory that for me, the hypothetical Q helps to solve. And we know, for instance, like the Gospel of, we know the idea, we know that the existence of sayings gospels was a thing. We discovered the Gospel of Thomas. That's basically what it is. And the Gospel of Thomas is much later, but it looks like what the hypothetical Q would have looked like, right? It's a series of Jesus said this, then Jesus said this, then Jesus said this. There's also some pretty compelling reconstructions of Q that are sort of reverse engineered from Matthew and Luke that read pretty well as a narrative. And so like you can kind of see how it would look. For the sake of your audience, so that we're not just getting too wonky here, the theory is that this other source existed. We know that Matthew and Luke plagiarized from Mark a great deal, but there's also content in Matthew and Luke that's very, very similar, if not identical, that's not in Mark, that appears mostly to be stuff Jesus is saying, right? So Jesus opens his mouth and says something or teaches something. And the theory is that they used a common source called Q, and that once they became popular gospels, Q ceased to be reproduced because what's the point? All of Q's in Matthew and Luke, and so we no longer have Q, which is a fine theory.
And the word, the Q comes from the Latin word for source, which starts with a Q.
For quaela, right? Yeah,
just to throw that in.
For source, yes. Yeah. And it's nothing to do with QAnon. It's just people like to use the word Q when dealing with mysteries for whatever reason. That's again, that's a whole other trope and art and conversation that could be had. I'm completely like, I'm not sold on the idea that Q existed. I think that there's probably other ways of explaining it, but I think it's a perfectly feasible theory. I don't think it does anything for historicism. I just don't. Like, I think the reason that people like Carrier are allergic to Q is because he worries that it's sort of like, but I just don't think it is. I don't think it helps the historicist case at all. I don't believe there was somebody who was taking notes of what Jesus was saying, and all of those sayings are very clearly like they could come from essentially a mishmash of like a little bit of Stoicism, a little bit of Paul, and a little bit of reinterpretation of the Old Testament. And there's just nothing there where I'm like, oh well, Jesus must have existed if somebody said this. Yeah, I mean, I typically think of Matthew and Luke as probably later than most scholars do. I don't think the earlier, I think the dating of Matthew to like 75 AD is just wishful thinking. I just don't think so. And so I can imagine that Q came into existence sometime after Mark, when the popularity of a historical Jesus was already sort of well on its way, and that people, wrote a list of teachings and sayings of this figure. And they could also have been revelatory. This could have been someone who like had a vision of Christ in heaven saying these things, right? There's just nothing about the existence of Q that I think is useful one way or the other. But I love the theory. I think it's really compelling as a textual theory, but little else.
Something like the Gospel of Thomas. I mean, it's also a sayings gospel.
Correct.
And it seems to have a very otherworldly type of quality to it as well.
But it also has some overlap. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't make any goddamn sense. And you're like, what were they talking about? And what do these people believe?
Right.
But then there's also stuff that's just like verbatim from the Gospels. So it's an interesting sort of point on the map along the evolution of early Christianity. We have this diversion into very weird places.
I think it's important that, because there is that myth that like Christianity springs, and I mean, like the Orthodox like to say they're the original Christians. Well, sorry, buddy, you're not. You're whatever was left when Constantine took over. So you can at least say 325 AD, but there were so many communities and so many groups, and so many varying different beliefs. I mean, like the Nag Hammadi scrolls, I mean, just proves that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there was an idea in one of these things that I watched that even even just lumping them all together as the Gnostics may not be actually correct, that we may be dealing with so many different ideas and beliefs that it's just easier to lump them all together in that way.
Yeah, I think Gnosticism, I still use the term for the sake of academic convenience, but I think it's mostly lost its value as a real useful term, because it just doesn't really describe anything anymore. The early Christianity, the different Jesus clubs were so rich in diversity that it's just like not worth pretending there was this one strain that's sort of post-Pauline and everything else, and that they were fundamentally different, because they weren't, but they were, right? And like, they were different from each other in ways that are as different as they are each from Paul. So I completely agree with that.
And it makes sense, because they're kind of isolated from each other. I mean, even in Paul's letters, a lot of what he's trying to do in the letters is, okay, guys, get back with the program, get back with what I'm telling you, because you're kind of diverging from the path. So all all these things just start to happen. And once you get into I think you get into the 3rd century, that's when the really big persecution, like the Decian persecution, Diocletian, and these things start to happen. So there's actually a lot that just gets lost. Yeah. And even in that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's turn to the non-Christian accounts, and the two that are brought up frequently are Tacitus, and Josephus. Josephus is a little more major than Tacitus, but let's tackle Tacitus first. What he is saying about
what's Tacitus saying?
So he says, but all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor and okay. So what's going on is he's talking about Nero, I believe. And then, Tacitus is actually writing. I think he's in the 2nd century, if memory
Right.
serves correct.
Yeah.
So he says, so the Roman historian, and I think he also has some personal knowledge of this because he's dealing with Christians when he's working. Maybe don't actually. Maybe I'm getting him confused with Pliny or somebody.
Yeah, you're thinking of Pliny. Yeah.
Right. So he says,
But he was close to Pliny. So
right.
I mean they
Yeah.
were
Yeah. So
yeah, they were
Pliny is
colleagues.
he's working for Trajan,
Hmm.
and they're trying to get the cult of the emperor, and we're trying to get these people to at least make a sacrifice to the state because that's how we make our
Right.
money, basically. So like the persecution hasn't really started in earnest, like I said. But
Hmm.
so he's writing about Nero. He's about a century later, and he says, "But all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor and the propitiations of the gods, did not banish the sinister belief that conflagration was the result of an order." So that's talking about the fire of Rome. Consequently, to
Right.
get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace.
Hmm. Hmm.
Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius
Hmm.
Pilate. And a
Hmm.
most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world would find their center and become popular. How do you
Right.
really feel, Tacitus? Don't hold back. So
Yeah.
one of the things that came to mind when he mentions this about Pontius Pilate, we know Pontius Pilate existed. We do know
Yes.
that.
Yep.
Um, I don't know if it would have been so hard. I know this is speculation, but so a lot of this is. I don't know if it would have been so hard for especially at this time, like the Visigoths and the Vandals haven't sacked Rome yet.
Right.
So would it have been too hard for Tacitus to go to like some hall of records and oh, okay, Pontius Pilate did execute this guy. I mean,
Yeah.
could he have accessed something that we just are not is available to him that's not available to us anymore?
The thing about that passage, right, and the one that sort of is the most suspect is that the name Christus doesn't really seem that it has any connection to Christianity. And right, like Christus is not a reasonable name that you would choose for the Jesus character, right? It'd be Christos, first of all, right? And yeah, like we never really know which of these historical documents. I mean, like Josephus, obviously, like the Testimonium Flavian is I think pretty clearly a forgery, and pretty clearly a later addition to it. So it's really hard to say. You're also, of course, dealing with something that's occurring decades later, and you just don't, like, if somebody, you know in 30 years were to talk about like what he heard about some random event that was pretty much undocumented 30 years earlier, I don't think today we would take it as very convincing evidence. It's something, I guess, but it's not, it's sort of like it's the same problem basically that I have with the argument from Galatians of the brother of the Lord, right? Where in Galatians, after Paul has already said everything I know I got from Revelation, he goes and he meets Peter, which does not go well. And he also says that he met with James, brother of the Lord, and that obviously that means that Jesus had a biological brother because the Gospels confirm it. Well, again, we can't use Gospels for any confirmation. And we also know that Peter or Paul routinely says that anybody who is baptized is a brother in the Lord, right? Like that's just a title, and I just don't think there's any value to that whatsoever. But we also have to remember that like a lot of we don't have the sort of original versions of these documents. A lot of these documents are tampered with and whatever else, and people read into them what
Well,
they
that's
want to read into
possible.
them.
Yeah.
And so it's just it's so sketchy. As for the crucifixion scene itself, none of it makes any sense. None of it lines up with the way things were actually done. The idea that Jesus would go to like the Sanhedrin first, it's nonsense. Like that's not how anything worked, right? In terms of Roman law and Jewish law and the interaction of the two and anything else. We know that Pontius Pilate was a notorious hanging judge, right? Like that he was a ruthless executor of anybody who thought was a problem. I'm quite sure that there were similar sort of cults of personality of people very much like sort of the historical Jesus, who Pontius Pilate really did crack down on, right? And I'm sure that those cults existed. I just don't think it's this. I just don't think that it's the same, right? I don't think it's the same person. I don't think it's the same connection. But I do find the Tacitus thing slightly more compelling than the Josephus thing, which I find not compelling whatsoever.
Sure, we'll talk about that. I'll talk about that in a second. It's just interests me that he does mention Pilate.
Yes,
and Tacitus is probably of the same class that Pilate would have been.
Yeah,
and so it just seems to me like he had to have pulled that from somewhere.
Yeah.
Now, did he?
I'm sure he did.
I don't think Josephus. I mean, I guess Josephus does talk about Pilate, but I don't think he talks about Pilate in relation to Jesus.
Pilate was quite notorious, and it's worth also noting that Pliny, who Tacitus was very close to, also just has no understanding of Christians at all, and everything that he gets about Christians is very secondhand and very, very sketchy, and seems to be coming from the word of Christians themselves.
Yeah,
right. Who are telling him their own story.
Right,
and again,
they're just telling them what their beliefs are, basically.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so again, it's very sort of like we need a lot more of a smoking gun about how Tacitus came to say what Tacitus came to say, and also why Tacitus refers to Jesus wrong, because he refers to him by a title that is, again, if anything, lays credence to the idea that he's getting all of this knowledge very secondhand, and like
that's
right,
possible.
and it's all sort of coming from a myth of a certain kind of group, because Christus is just not the name of something. It's
his tone in that passage is very dismissive. Like, I mean, these people are weird. Like, they believe weird things. Like, I mean, come on, guys. Just, and so I could just see him just like, oh, he's like Christus, whatever.
Yes,
I'm not. Who cares?
100%. But it also speaks to the idea. It also speaks to the idea that there wasn't this monumental event where Pontius Pilate executed this guy, and like it caused it just sort of seems like it makes even more of sort of an afterthought of the historical Jesus as just a nothing burger, right, for lack of a better term, which I just, again, I have a hard time believing people would build their religion around that. But Josephus. Yeah, Josephus.
He's usually the big one.
He is.
Now I mean, if you read Josephus, there are some things that are there is something that obviously is inserted into Josephus.
Yeah.
That Jesus was the Son of God and all this kind of. Josephus would not have believed this.
No. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
That's true.
And I think there is this idea that Eusebius might have something to do with some of that. And right.
Oh, Eusebius. One of my faves. One of the great frauds of all history.
But I guess the real thing is there's this the debated passage.
Yeah.
Is between the historicist and the mythicist is about James.
Yes.
So what's this all about?
So he refers to like James the Just, I think, right?
There's also something called the Slavonic Josephus that I've heard is that has concepts that may not be so Christian. That is something that it was apparently found in Russia, end of 19th century.
Interesting.
Yeah. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but
I have not. I got to look into it. So what he says in Antiquities is this, and again, it is incredibly suspect. So he says, Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, which is not something that Josephus would have said, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. But as for those who seemed the most equitable of the citizens, and such as were the most unlikely to ease uneasy of the breach of the laws, blah, 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 blah. All right, so here's the thing, right? The part where Josephus says, who is the brother of Jesus, who is known as Christ, as you just mentioned, we can ignore that. Josephus did not originally write that. There's just absolutely no way, right? Because Josephus was a very traditional Jew who came from a Sadduceic family, right?
Yeah, he did. Right.
Yeah, so that's not, he's not writing that. He's not writing Jesus who was called Christ. And even if he did write that he was a brother of Jesus or a brother of the Lord or whatever, right? Again, that's something that Paul establishes, but doesn't mean anything biological. It's just not useful. And if we take that out, if we assume that the Jesus part and the Christ part is added, then we just have a guy named James who is just involved in some kind of civil uprising, who is like executed for it. And it's just not useful. I mean, it just strikes me as someone, a later Christian, seeing this passage and being like, oh, he must be talking about that James. I'm going to throw Jesus in there, so that we have this, this historical evidence of it. It's too thin. It's just not compelling enough. And even if it were authentic, which again, the language of it says no, it's still being written decades after the fact. And there's no reason to believe that like what Josephus is saying is based on anything other than hearsay, and just stories that he's heard that he's writing into history. We have to remember that the way we think about history today is not the way that history has been written in history, right?
That's true, right? I think that was my point when I made the comment about the Enlightenment. I mean, I think that's
right.
Yeah,
right. So the idea of having corroboration and sources and not just doing something to please the people who are paying you, right? Like these are new ideas. So again, like between Tacitus and Josephus, is it nothing? No, it's not. And if you can prove to me that these writings are authentic and that they somehow through the decades have a really good reason to know that this Jesus guy existed and not just something that they heard, then that becomes compelling evidence. But the missing link, so to speak, isn't there. And I don't think we should pretend that it is. I think people pretend that it is because people still think the Gospels must have some kind of historical value. And I don't see anything that's compelling about that either. And until I see it, then again, I have to go with the model that checks more boxes for me and it explains more about sort of like where this religion came from and why. And that's the better one. I mean, when Ehrman goes out of his way to present the idea, like he, as a historicist and as a agnostic, borderline atheist historicist,
right,
he has to come up with this idea of mass delusion. He understands that for the historicist model to work, that the so-called disciples, who are never mentioned until the Gospels, they're only ever apostles until the Gospels. There's no mentioning of disciples anywhere else. But the so-called disciples must have believed that this guy that they hung out with came back to life somehow, and really trips over himself trying to explain that. I don't think it's impossible, but it's a very big hurdle to clear when you acknowledge that you have to clear that hurdle. And I just think, well, what if we don't have to clear the hurdle? What if we just take the hurdle away and see what's there? And I think that that's just a better conclusion.
Yeah, it's interesting. But in that respect, if you don't have that, then this mythical figure is in this other heaven, is crucified, returns. What is the purpose of that resurrection? What is that purpose in that cosmology?
To defeat death.
Defeat death.
So this is the right. I'm glad you asked that.
Here and there is what. So
this is where it gets complicated. Actually, I think a really good way of illuminating this, and now I'm going to talk really nicely about Bart Ehrman. He wrote a book about the afterlife and about the evolution of the afterlife as a concept.
Yeah.
Judaism has no afterlife, right?
Right.
And Judaism, classical Judaism especially, had no concept of the soul, that the thing that makes people alive is the breath of God, and that's the essence of living things. And you see this, in fact, in the Gospels, right? When Jesus dies, it specifically says he breathed his last, and you know, his spirit was he commended his spirit to heaven, right? So what starts to happen, and if we look at what Paul is saying, what we see is that Paul is expecting that the world is about to end, and that when the reclamation of the kingdom of David and the New Jerusalem happens, that those perfect heaven bodies are going to be the new bodies in which people will occupy forever, right? And they're immaculate, pure heaven bodies that are waiting for them. But Jesus has to return first to like give them those bodies. And so by being crucified, Jesus in the heaven sphere defeats the devil, defeats evil, defeats all death. And Paul very clearly believes that the world is going to end in his lifetime, and that people should not bother doing, you know, getting married. Paul either wasn't married or was and left his wife. We don't really know. But like clearly isn't married at the time that he's writing. And by the way, I think the reason that Jesus isn't married, and that's weird for a rabbi in Mark, is because Paul wasn't married, and that Jesus is basically Paul, right? That Mark's writing just a fictional kind of version of Paul. So you know, there's this imminent New Jerusalem, and that we're all going to live in our resurrection bodies, but we have to hold out until that happens. But Jesus, in defeating the devil, defeats death, and once we get our resurrection bodies, they will be immortal, they will be eternal, and we will all live happily ever after, forever, in the New Jerusalem, so on and so forth. Now, the reason that I bring up the Ermon book is because one of the things that he points out is when we look at the evolution of the Christian idea of the afterlife in heaven, is that essentially in order to fill the gap, because Jesus kept not coming, right? Jesus kept not showing up and the world kept not ending, we start to see evidence that there is a belief in a kind of waiting room. So if you die before Jesus comes back, you go into the heaven space and you hang out there in your resurrection body, thanks to Jesus, until Jesus and the rest of his gang, you included, go back to Earth and the apocalypse and, you know, all of that stuff in New Jerusalem. And then over time, that just became what happens when you die. So there's this sort of progression, right, of that belief system of like, oh crap, world still hasn't ended. How do I explain what's going to happen to believers in the short period of time between their death and the imminent end of all things, and the new rebirth?
We cut out that space. We cut out that extra step. Yeah.
Right. And so the short answer is like exactly the same thing that he died for on Earth, right? To defeat evil, to eradicate original sin, to eliminate the entire need for any temple cult, and to give individuals direct access to God, right, as the final sacrificial Messiah, who also was able to die and then undie, which is what we're all hoping for.
So if we just kind of like a little bit in conclusion here, so if we want to understand the in your viewpoint, what is the root of Christianity, then we need to go to the seven real, I guess, the seven, like that's undoubtedly Paul.
Yes,
that's where you're drawing from, and that's looks like Galatians, First Thessalonians, First and Second Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, and Philemon.
Right. So Second Thessalonians is contested. There's some who believe that it's authentic, and some who don't. I tend to err on the side of that it's not authentic. But so that means that the seven authentic ones are Galatians, First Thessalonians, First and Second Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, Philemon. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then also Colossians and Ephesians are contested as well.
they are contested. Hebrews is also contested, but I
Yeah.
don't think there's really any question about Hebrews.
They
But
don't even ascribe that to Paul anymore. I don't think it used to be,
no, and it's
but
not even really an epistle.
yeah,
It's very weird
right.
that it's there. I mean, it's a great piece of writing. In a vacuum, it's really interesting. It doesn't really tell us anything important about Paul. And again, I would always err towards the things that we're sure about. So, Second Thessalonians. If you're really interested in just sort of really focusing on the earliest sources that we do have, right, I would go to the ones that the majority of scholars are sure about. And just like on the note of kind of scholarship and sort of the authority of scholars, someone asked me like pretty recently how I kind of, as someone who by nature I tend to default to academic consensus, right? And it's like, this is not academic consensus what you're saying here. And I think it's always worth pointing out that like in religious studies, academic consensus changes more than really any other field. And with this particular topic, there's so much emotion and so much personal identity that's rooted in it that it's really hard. Like if you're a mythicist, you're going to have a really, really hard time getting a job at a university, right? Because not just that it's not the academic consensus, but that it's also like it feels like you are denying the validity of a religion that frankly has a power monopoly in the US, right? And in the West. And I completely understand that. Like I think a lot of people who I admire, I think they would more likely be on my side if they felt it was worth it. You know what I mean? That if they felt that like the ability to get a tenured position while holding that perspective, even in a very secular field, right? It's still very, very difficult. So I think there's people who would be receptive to it, but just don't think it's worth the kind of academic price. And then there's the other people who are like, look, this is my religion, and it's like, great, that's your religion, and so you should not think differently. You should stick to your religion because that's how religion works, and so ignore everything that I've just said, right? It's completely fine. Yeah. But I would also point out that within the last century, academic consensus was that Moses existed, and now it is not, and it's pretty firmly not, right? And things change really quickly within this field. It's a unique area of inquiry, so things change, and as I said, it's sort of I just kind of feel that it would be intellectually dishonest for me to not from where I am right now approach the way I study this and the way that I talk about it from that perspective, because it would just be a cop out, and I'd be a liar. Yeah. I don't want to be.
It's interesting from listening to you and the things that you told me to watch and kind of digging into this over the last few days. I revisited the scene from Last Temptation of Christ, where I think if you've seen the movie, the setup that the last temptation is for him to have a wife and a family, and there's this scene, Willem Dafoe plays Jesus, and he's got the family and the man, and he encounters Paul, who's Harry Dean Stanton.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
But it's interesting because it's almost a reflection of some of these theories that I've been hearing, where he says you're telling Jesus says you're telling lies about me. I'm not that guy. I'm not the one that died and rose again. And Paul just basically looks at him and says, okay, I don't need you. These people are happy. They want the risen Christ. They don't want you,
Mm-hmm.
like,
yeah,
you're basically saying you mean nothing to me. Like, they want the other guy.
Yeah.
So I always thought that was an interesting. It's
a great point.
I don't know if I think that might be in Kazusaki's novel, but a lot of it might be Paul Schrader. So I don't know.
I haven't
But
read the novel. I from what I know, I wouldn't be
yeah, it's
surprised, but I also wouldn't be surprised if it's a
yeah,
so.
yeah. The
It's a
the
great movie. I
no,
gotta watch that again.
yeah, the novel is pretty bizarre. But
Yeah,
it's
that's
got
what
a
I
lot of bizarre
understand.
imagery. But
Yeah.
the like there's this whole section where like Jesus is walking with Matthew, right? And like Matthew is basically he shows him this book that he's writing. So he's writing the book of Matthew. And
Mm.
Jesus says, "This never happened. I never said." And he said, "But you said, Lord, you don't understand. Like He's basically doing like automatic writing. He's like, you don't understand. Like this force takes over me and is writing this. I'm not writing this. So
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
and then Lazarus is basically a zombie. You know, he's like
Yep.
falling. He's not actually resurrected. He's falling apart. So there's a lot of weird stuff that they took a lot of weird stuff out of the movie that was in Kazasaki's book. So
I was pretty young when that movie came out.
yeah,
It must have been what's it, 80, 88 or
yeah,
87.
yeah,
So I
yeah,
was like 8 or 9 years old. But
yeah.
like
That was
oh man, I remember the freak out
oh yeah,
when
yeah.
that movie
That
came
was
out.
one.
Holy cow.
That was one that like I remember just like staying away from. Like
Yeah.
you're not gonna watch that movie. I
Yeah.
mean, I had an interesting dynamic. My mother was a Christian. My dad was an atheist at the time, and so it
Okay.
was like later on that was like the big forbidden movie. And then when when you really watch it though, you're like, wait a minute, this is like probably the most really like this is mainstream Nicene Creed Christianity because it's basically the struggle between the divine and human nature of Christ.
Yep.
And that's what they were trying to put. I think if Scorsese had maybe cut some scenes out and
Yeah.
just implied that Jesus had sex, I think things would have been fine. But the book had a lot of problems too. I mean, the Greek Orthodox
Yeah.
Church banned it in Greece, and so he may have had some of the issues. But that really was I can remember it being when I was in Chattanooga at the time when I was a kid, and I remember people picketing, and like it was crazy. But
Interesting irony is that the reverse side of that, the movie that those same people were like, go see this movie, it's the second coming of Christ, was the Passion of the Christ, which
yeah,
is
right.
fully inauthentic to the Gospels. It's like, where are you getting this shit from? Like, this is, I don't remember there being a 45-minute torture scene anywhere.
Hey, part two's coming out next year.
Oh, please, oh my God, don't get me started. Yeah, this like deeply anti-Semitic mishmash of a few of the Gospels, of like 20 minutes of them, where Mel Gibson is mostly concerned with just Jesus getting beaten to within an inch of his life.
Yeah,
And
it's
bad.
It comes.
It's a bad movie.
He comes from a very traditionalist Catholic point of
Oh,
view,
not
and
even
they're
traditionalist. He's
but
yeah,
see,
yeah.
I think people in some ways misinterpret that. Like it's not Vatican II Catholicism.
No,
Like his
no,
father
he rejects Vatican
is
II.
or
Yeah,
was rejects Vatican II, but
yep,
there is a lot of emphasis in that community about suffering.
yes. I know.
And I think that that's what he was trying to for most of the world. It just looked like torture porn,
Right.
but I think what he was trying to project was this Catholic, this traditionalist Catholic
Yeah.
theme of suffering.
Right. And this guy did it for you for some reason. And
Yeah,
so you
yeah.
can watch him
But
with his ribs getting cut open. But like we already had Braveheart, and he already gets that's already happens in Braveheart. So
there is and there is a lot of. I mean, it's been a long time since I've seen it, but I went to the theater to see it. My God, it's been a long time, but yeah, I mean, I do see that like and I think it does play on some of the Christ killer mythology.
I will give a plug. The best historical Jesus thing I've ever seen, the Discovery Channel about 15 years ago, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, did a series called Who Was Jesus, which tries to take a very like it tries to sort of build the historical Jesus. It sort of tries to show you an archaeological and historical Jesus that convincingly the Gospels could have been based on. It also casts a like Palestinian actor in the role of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't give him long hair. Like it does everything right from a if Jesus existed, it probably looked like this. And, I think if Jesus existed, it's probably pretty close to what that would have looked like. And I can't recommend that enough. It's a really, really well done and really sort of like thoughtful and respectful series. And it presents a compelling case of the historicist argument. But again, the reason that sort of I can't quite get there is that it still leaves so many questions to me that I just don't think that narrative answers. But if you want a really good like historical Jesus, part documentary, part sort of dramatic reenactment series, Who Was Jesus? Discovery Channel, 10-ish years ago. I've used it a lot in my own classes.
Nice.
Good stuff. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, John, this has been awesome, man. I really great discussion. I've really had a good time.
Yeah, me too. Thank you.
But just a real quick recap about your podcast and what's next for you.
So we'll start with the fun one. 1999, where I talk about the movies of the greatest movie year in history. It's a completely well outside of my normal academic field. We bring some smart stuff into that sometimes too, but it's a fun movie podcast with an old friend of mine. That comes out every other Monday. You can get it on all of the platforms. If you want to hear me talking about more serious and religion-y stuff, as well as conspiracy theories and the far right and all kinds of other things, that is Hard to Believe. And again, I am doing from the time that we're recording this, I think I have one more episode that's coming out before it transitions into a new show called Pod Only Knows, where we're going to focus more on the modern religious landscape. And it's going to be great. I'm really looking forward to it. So, But you have a lot of old episodes to go back and listen to of some really cool interviews that I've done. I did an episode on Scientology. That's my most popular episode by far, with Tony Ortega a few years ago, and just I talk about comic books. I talk about a whole bunch of stuff. So if you like listening to me talk for the last, I don't know, hour and a half or whatever it is, and you like hearing smart and interesting people, check it out. And I hope you stick around for the new one.
Absolutely. And you said if you're already subscribed to Hard to Believe, you'll be on the same feed.
The feed is crossing over, so we're going to do an episode, the two of us, pretty soon, where we explain what's happening so we don't freak everybody out. But you'll see a new logo, a new name, but it's the same feed, and it's still me there. So
I gotcha. Okay. All right, this has been excellent. John, thank you for joining us. John Brooks, everybody. Really interesting, great show. Stay on the line for me. I'm going to just close this out. Guys, conspirinormal.com, Conspirinormal YouTube channel, Conspirinormal Patreon. You guys should know where to find that by now. But if you want to join the Patreon, helps us out, so we can get more excellent guests like this one on. And that is patreon.com/Conspirinormal. There's several tiers on there, one of which is the $10 tier, which is the Mystic Crew. That's with a K. And where we will be doing some of our Strange Realities online events. First one coming up on April 21st with Travis Watson, and really looking forward to that. And also, usual plug, check out the YouTube channel that I am producing called Nevaeh's Nightmare. That is, if you don't know how to spell her name, that is heaven backwards, which is something we've kind of been touching on a lot in this discussion. So guys, Sergio, I don't know if he'll be back next week. I think he'll be in Seattle at that point, but join us next week. Got another interesting episode coming up with probably a special guest in the studio. So stick around, and we will talk to you later on Conspirinormal.